I came home that evening like I always did, tired from a long day at work, but glad to be back. The house was quiet, except for the unmistakable sound of my wife's voice echoing from the living room. She was on the phone, and not just casually chatting either. She was practically yelling with excitement, her words spilling out so fast I could barely make sense of them. Curious, I stepped into the room and gave her a questioning look, but before I could say anything, she shot me a glare, not one of those leave me alone looks, but a sharp, almost angry expression. It stopped me in my tracks. I leaned against the doorway, waiting for her to finish. As soon as she noticed me, her tone shifted abruptly. She dropped her voice to a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. That was unusual. Normally, she didn't care if I overheard her conversations. This time, though, it was like she didn't want me knowing what she was saying. I crossed my arms and waited, but she seemed in no rush to hang up. I'm not one to pry, so I left her to it and went to the kitchen to grab a drink, but the whole thing didn't sit right with me. When she finally ended the call and walked into the kitchen, I decided to ask. "What was that all about?" I said, keeping my tone casual. Her response took me off guard. "I'm tired of this routine, that's what," she snapped. "Do you even realize how long it's been since we've gone anywhere or done anything fun?" Her sudden outburst left me staring at her for a moment. This wasn't the first time she'd brought up the monotony of our lives, but the venom in her voice was new. "Are you serious?" I shot back. "You don't even work. I'm the one who busts my ass every day to keep this house running. What do you expect? That I quit my job so we can go live it up? Because, newsflash, we wouldn't last a month without my paycheck." My words hit a nerve. She didn't say anything, just turned on her heel and stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me standing there. Hours passed in silence. I wasn't one to dwell on arguments, but I'd be lying if I said her reaction didn't bother me. Eventually, she came back out, her tone calmer but her words no less surprising. "I'm sorry," she said. "Maybe I overreacted. But listen, my friend invited me to this gathering. It's supposed to be really exclusive and, well, kind of secretive. Her relatives are organizing it, and it's all themed around the 1950s. Costumes, jazz, blues, you name it. Apparently, there will even be special guests. I'm not sure what else to expect, but it sounds exciting." She paused for a moment, then added, "I would invite you, but it's during the day, and you've got work. Don't worry, though, I'll tell you all about it. Maybe I'll even sneak something back from the buffet for you." That last comment made me laugh despite myself. "All right," I said, shaking my head. "Have fun, I guess." Later that night, as we got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole thing was off. A secretive 1950s-themed event? Special guests? Why all the mystery? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of event was this, and why was it so hush-hush? The question lingered in my mind as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my wife bustling around the bedroom. It was earlier than usual, and as I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, I saw her standing in front of the mirror. She was dressed in a tight black dress that looked like it belonged on the red carpet. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled to perfection. It was such a stark contrast to her usual laid-back morning routine that I barely recognized her. Before I could say anything, she grabbed her bag, shot me a quick glance, and darted out of the house without a word. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, trying to process what just happened. She wasn't one to dress up like that without a reason, let alone rush out so early. Usually, any events she attended started much later in the day. I told myself it wasn't worth overthinking, not yet, at least. Work wasn't going to wait for me, so I got ready and headed out, still mulling over her unusual behavior. At the office, I brought it up casually with a couple of colleagues during lunch. One of them, a guy who'd been around the block more times than he cared to admit, gave me a knowing look. "You ever heard of those secret parties?" he said. I shook my head, and he went on to explain some wild story about an exclusive swinger event he'd attended years ago. According to him, the dress code was exactly the kind of thing my wife had been wearing that morning. "If I were you," he said, leaning in, "I'd think twice about what's really going on." The comment sat with me for the rest of the day. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the secrecy, the early morning exit, and now this suggestion from a coworker, it all felt a bit too coincidental. Still, I told myself not to get carried away. Maybe it was just a regular outing with her friend, like she'd mentioned the night before. But the thought of what else it could be lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. When work finally wrapped up, I drove home, half expecting some kind of explanation or at least a sign of normalcy. Instead, I walked into the house and found her sprawled out on the couch, clutching a half-empty bottle of what looked like expensive whiskey. She was completely out of it, her dress slightly rumpled, her makeup smudged. The sight of her like that stopped me in my tracks. My chest tightened, and a flood of thoughts raced through my head. I stood there for a minute, staring at her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The alcohol, the state she was in, the silence, it all pointed to something I didn't want to acknowledge. My mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion: she had cheated on me. The idea was like a punch to the gut, but I wasn't about to start making accusations without proof. I needed answers, and the only place I knew to start was her phone. Carefully, I reached for it where it sat on the coffee table. Unlocking it, I braced myself for what I might find. Messages, photos, call logs, anything that could confirm or deny my growing suspicions. But to my surprise, there was nothing. No strange messages, no unusual contacts, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. It was almost too clean, which only made me more uneasy. I set the phone down and turned my attention back to her. She was still out cold, the bottle now slipping from her hand. Whatever had happened, I wasn't going to get answers tonight. I gently took the bottle from her, set it aside, and lifted her into my arms. She stirred slightly but didn't wake as I carried her to the bedroom and laid her down. As I pulled the blanket over her, I resolved to get to the bottom of it in the morning. Tomorrow was a day off, and I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. For now, though, all I could do was wait and hope that whatever explanation she had would make sense of this whole mess. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of my wife's voice. She stood by the bed, shaking my shoulder. Before I even fully opened my eyes, I was hit with a wave of irritation. Who wakes someone up like that after a night like the one she had? I sat up and looked at her, still groggy but already brimming with questions. But before I could say anything, my frustration boiled over. "Who were you with last night?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. She stared at me like I had just grown a second head. "Are you serious?" she said. "I was with you. I came home, and you put me to bed. Did you hit your head or something?" Her calm response only made me angrier. "You left early in the morning, dressed to the nines, and came back drunk with a bottle of whiskey," I shot back. "Don't play dumb with me. I know what happens at those kinds of events." Her face twisted in confusion and then annoyance. "What events? What are you even talking about?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You sound ridiculous. Who's been filling your head with this nonsense?" I wasn't about to back down. "One of my colleagues told me," I said. "He knows about these secret parties. I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid." She let out an exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes. "Your colleague is an idiot," she said flatly. "And so are you if you actually believe him." Before I could retort, she pulled out her phone. "You want proof?" "Fine," she said, her fingers flying over the screen. "My friend's about to send me the pictures from last night. Give it 10 minutes, and you'll see exactly what we were up to." Her confidence threw me off, but I stayed silent, watching as she texted her friend. She put the phone down and crossed her arms again, staring at me like she was daring me to say something else. Sure enough, a few minutes later, her phone buzzed. She opened the message and handed it to me. The screen was filled with photos and videos of her and her friend at what appeared to be a very upscale restaurant. The images showed nothing suspicious, just them smiling for the camera, surrounded by plates of gourmet food and glasses of wine. The videos captured a live jazz performance, complete with a full band and dim, atmospheric lighting. There was nothing incriminating about any of it. "See," she said, her tone sharp. "This is what I was doing. Eating, drinking, and listening to music. No secret parties, no swinging, none of that garbage your colleague fed you. Feel stupid yet?" I handed her phone back, my jaw clenched. She might have been telling the truth about the photos, but I wasn't ready to let it go just yet. "Fine," I said. "But what were you doing there, really? You don't even like jazz." She rolled her eyes again and sat down on the edge of the bed. "I told you," she said. "I went to support my friend. She's the one who got the invitation, not me. I barely talked to anyone there." Honestly, most of the night was her chatting with some older guy who turned out to be related to the people hosting the event. Her next words caught me off guard. "Actually, that guy mentioned something about a job for me," she said. "Apparently, he's looking for someone with my charisma. It sounds interesting, but I don't know much yet. He invited both of us to dinner next weekend to talk about it. I made it very clear I have a husband, and he said that's even better." I leaned back, trying to process everything she had just said. A job? With some older guy she barely knew? And now he wanted to meet us both? Something about it didn't sit right with me. As she got up to leave the room, I made a mental note. Whoever this guy was, I was going to figure him out. No way was I letting this slide without knowing exactly what he wanted with my wife. The days leading up to the weekend were more of the same. My wife was glued to her phone, chatting endlessly with her friend. Every time I tried to press her for details, she would just brush me off with a vague response or tell me I'd find out soon enough. Once, I even called her friend directly, hoping to get some clarity, but she laughed and said, "You'll see when you get there." It was maddening. Meanwhile, my wife spent her evenings trying on different outfits. Dresses, heels, accessories, our bedroom turned into her personal dressing room. She didn't share much with me about her plans, and I was left to watch the show with growing curiosity and irritation. Finally, the day arrived. We drove together to the restaurant, an upscale place with valet parking and chandeliers visible through the windows. As we stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel slightly out of place, even in my best suit. My wife, on the other hand, looked like she belonged there, her outfit perfectly chosen for the occasion. Across the room, her friend waved enthusiastically, guiding us to a table where an older man was already seated. He stood up as we approached, smiling warmly, and shook my hand firmly. "Good evening," he said. "Thank you for coming. I understand how this might look, especially to you," he added, addressing me directly. That piqued my interest immediately. What exactly was this meeting about, and why was he so quick to acknowledge my presence? I took a seat, keeping my guard up as the man continued. He introduced himself as the owner of a company that organizes auctions, but not the kind I had initially imagined. "Let me explain," he said. "Years ago, your wife's friend's parents helped me during a very difficult time in my life. Since then, I've considered her almost like a daughter. When I met your wife, I couldn't help but notice her presence. She has the perfect demeanor and appearance for what we do. Our auctions are elegant affairs, and having the right person to present the lots is crucial. Your wife, I believe, would be an excellent fit." His words were carefully chosen, and while they seemed complimentary, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I glanced at my wife, who listened intently, her expression a mix of curiosity and intrigue. The man continued, "These aren't the fast-talking, high-pressure auctions you might be imagining. Everything is conducted at a relaxed pace, with a focus on style and sophistication. It's less about speed and more about creating an atmosphere. I assure you, it's straightforward work, and I personally guarantee her safety and well-being." The more he spoke, the more I found myself softening to the idea. It didn't sound as shady as I'd initially feared, though I still had questions. For now, I held my tongue and let the conversation unfold. My wife thanked him for the opportunity, and before long, the dinner wrapped up. As we were getting ready to leave, he added, "Your first day will be Monday. There's a special auction coming up, and I'd like you to be the one to handle it. Just remember, the items being auctioned are confidential, so discretion is key." My wife agreed without hesitation, promising to keep everything under wraps. On the drive home, she seemed excited, talking about how interesting the evening had been. "I'm really looking forward to seeing what this is all about," she said. "The secrecy makes it even more intriguing." Her enthusiasm was almost contagious, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thoughts in the back of my mind. "You'll tell me what's going on, right?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment before replying, "Of course, but only what I'm allowed to. I don't want to risk losing the job before I even start. Still, if there's anything I can share, I will." Her tone was reassuring, but it didn't do much to ease my concerns. As we pulled into the driveway, her last words lingered in my mind. "I'm so curious about this assignment," she said, practically glowing. "It sounds like it'll be something really special." I nodded, keeping my own thoughts to myself. Whatever this secretive auction entailed, I was going to find out, one way or another. The week started like any other, with my wife getting ready for her new job. As I drank my morning coffee, she mentioned that her friend would be picking her up. I didn't think much of it until I heard the unmistakable purr of an engine outside. When I glanced out the window, I was floored. Her friend pulled up in a sleek, black Mercedes that looked like it cost more than our house. My wife's jaw dropped too when she stepped outside. She turned back to wave at me, an expression of surprise still plastered on her face, before hopping into the car and driving off. The sight of that car lingered in my mind throughout the day. I knew her friend came from a well-off family, but this was next-level wealth. It made me wonder what kind of circles my wife was stepping into with this job. Still, I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. She seemed genuinely excited about the work, and I had no reason yet to doubt her intentions. By the end of the week, she was glowing whenever she talked about her new role. "It's honestly so simple," she told me one evening. "I just present the items, announce the bids, and smile. That's it. Everyone's so professional and respectful. It's almost too easy." Her enthusiasm was infectious, though I couldn't help but prod a little. "Nobody's tried anything with you?" I asked, half joking. "Not a chance," she replied firmly. "Most of them are older, married, and honestly not even interested. Besides, I'm nothing special compared to their wives." Her answer put me at ease, at least for the moment. The routine seemed to settle in smoothly. Every morning, her friend arrived in that Mercedes to pick her up, and every evening, she returned home with stories about the day. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, which was both a relief and a source of mild curiosity. I'd expected more drama, given the secretive nature of the job, but it all seemed above board so far. Then, midway through dinner one evening, my phone buzzed. It was my boss, and the tone of the call immediately shifted my mood. "We've got a series of business trips coming up," he said, "and your presence is absolutely essential. These won't be back-to-back, but you'll be traveling on and off for the next few weeks." Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. My wife noticed my expression right away. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern flashing across her face. I explained the situation, frustrated by the abruptness of it all. "So, I'll be gone for stretches of time, starting next Monday," I said, setting the phone down. "That's just how it is, apparently." She nodded, her face softening. "It's okay," she said. "We'll manage. Besides, some time apart might be good for us. We'll miss each other, and it'll make the time we do have together even better." Her calm response surprised me, but before I could dwell on it, she added something that piqued my curiosity. "Actually, it's probably for the best," she said with a sly smile. I've got something big coming up at work. It's a surprise, but trust me, it's going to blow your mind when I tell you about it. You won't believe it. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite myself. What kind of surprise? I asked. She shook her head, laughing. Nice try, but you'll have to wait. Just focus on your trips, and when you're back, I'll fill you in on everything. I promise it'll be worth the wait. Her words left me both curious and cautious. Whatever this big thing was, it seemed important to her, and I wasn't going to push her for answers before she was ready. Still, as the days ticked by and my departure loomed closer, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly she had gotten herself into. The week-long business trip dragged on, each day feeling longer than the last. I kept in touch with my wife during the evenings, but our conversations were frustratingly vague. She seemed cheerful enough, but when I brought up the secret event she had mentioned before I left, she shut it down immediately. I can't talk about it over the phone, she said, her voice carrying an edge of excitement. I'll tell you everything when you get back. That only made me more impatient. By the fourth day, I couldn't stop thinking about how strange this all felt. Between her cryptic hints and the secrecy surrounding her job, my life was beginning to feel like some kind of low-budget spy movie. I resolved to get to the bottom of it as soon as I got home. Whatever she was hiding, it was time for some straight answers. When I finally returned, she was already waiting for me at the door, smiling from ear to ear. Her excitement seemed genuine, which threw me off guard. I half expected her to be defensive or evasive, but instead, she ushered me inside like I was late for something important. Come on, she said. Let's get you settled. You won't believe what I have to tell you. Once we were in the kitchen, she made us coffee and sat across from me, her energy practically radiating across the table. All right, I said, cutting to the chase. What was this big event you couldn't talk about? She took a sip of her coffee, savoring the moment before launching into her story. It was a huge banquet, she began. The kind you only see in movies. The food, the music, the people, everything was over-the-top extravagant. And then came the highlight of the evening, they auctioned off a night with a famous actress. My jaw practically hit the floor. A night? I asked, narrowing my eyes. What exactly does that mean? She rolled her eyes, clearly expecting my reaction. Not like that, she said. It's just an evening, a dinner, conversation, maybe some photos. Nothing inappropriate. But people were bidding insane amounts of money for it. The final bid was in the millions. As I tried to wrap my head around the absurdity of it, she continued. And that's not even the craziest part, she said, her tone dropping into something more serious. Do you remember how I told you my friend's family is close with my boss? Well, apparently, years ago, he was involved in some pretty shady business. He got into serious trouble, and her family helped him out. That's why he's so loyal to them now. The revelation didn't sit well with me. And he's not worried about that coming back to bite him? I asked. She shrugged. Honestly, I think he's beyond caring. He's got so much money and influence now that it probably doesn't matter. People like him always seem to find a way to stay untouchable. Before I could respond, she leaned forward, her excitement returning. Speaking of events, she said, do you have a day off coming up? My friend invited us to dinner. It's a small gathering, but I've been looking forward to it for ages. The lifestyle, the atmosphere, it's all so different from what we're used to. I raised an eyebrow, still processing everything she'd told me. What exactly is this dinner about? I asked. She smiled mysteriously and shrugged. She didn't give me all the details, she admitted. But she made it clear you're invited too. It'll be interesting, I promise. On the weekend, we set off for the dinner, and I found myself surprisingly relaxed. With everything that had been going on, I'd almost forgotten about the mysterious secrecy surrounding the event. As we drove, I turned to my wife. So, what's with all the hush-hush? I asked. She glanced at me and smiled, as if she had been expecting the question. Look, she said, it's just how things work there. They sell rare cars, old paintings, and other expensive stuff. A lot of people don't want their purchases made public because it could spark controversy or gossip. That's why everything's so discreet. Her explanation made sense, but I couldn't help feeling there was more to it. When we arrived, the atmosphere was as grand as I expected. The building itself was a masterpiece, with towering pillars and gilded decor that screamed wealth. We were greeted warmly as soon as we stepped inside. My wife's friend waved us over, introducing us to a few key players in the room. Everything seemed normal at first, though the level of extravagance was slightly overwhelming. Later in the evening, an older man approached us with a younger guy by his side. The older man was polite and charming, introducing himself as the host. His son, however, was an entirely different story. The kid, and I do mean kid, had the kind of smug face you'd expect to see on someone who'd never been told no in his life. He carried himself like the world owed him everything, and his eyes immediately wandered where they shouldn't have, my wife's chest. I held my tongue for as long as I could, but by the third time I caught him staring, I had enough. "Eyes up here, buddy," I said sharply. The older man's smile faltered for a moment, but then he chuckled and gave his son a swift smack on the back of the head. "Where are your manners?" he said, clearly embarrassed. "This man is your guest. Show some respect." He turned to me, extending his hand. "I like your directness," he said. "It's refreshing." I shook his hand, nodding in appreciation. It wasn't every day someone backed me up like that. The son, however, wasn't done. He muttered something under his breath about meeting me again soon. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it was odd enough to stick in my mind. I brushed it off for the moment and turned my attention back to the older man, who was now praising my wife. "She's a natural," he said. "Her work has brought in more money than I'd expected. You should be proud." I nodded, trying not to let my skepticism show. I was proud of her, sure, but I still had questions about this whole setup. As the evening progressed, the older man mentioned an upcoming auction, something much larger than the usual events. "You'll want to congratulate your wife," he said. "She's been instrumental in its planning. With her help, it's shaping up to be one of our most successful events yet." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "She's told me about your work trips. It's unfortunate you have to be away so often, but perhaps we can find a way to involve you in the future." The comment struck me as odd, but I just thanked him politely and moved on. Throughout the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the younger guy was still watching us. Sure enough, I spotted him in the corner, showing off photos of his new red Jaguar to a small group of people. He seemed to be soaking up their admiration, but his eyes would occasionally dart back to us. It was unsettling, but I decided not to make a scene. By the time we left, the night felt like a blur of luxury and strange encounters. On the drive home, my wife's mood was light, and she seemed genuinely pleased with how the evening had gone. I nodded along as she talked about the auction and her plans for the next week, but my mind kept circling back to one thing, the younger guy's parting words. "We'll meet again," he'd said. Was it a casual remark or something more? Either way, it left me uneasy. This dinner might have been our first introduction to that world, but something told me it wouldn't be our last. Back at home, I couldn't let the events of the previous evening slide. Over coffee, I turned to my wife and said, "You know that little punk? He spent the whole night ogling you, even after his father smacked him on the head. That's not sitting right with me." She raised an eyebrow but didn't seem too surprised. "Yeah, we've crossed paths a couple of times," she admitted. "But only because of my friend. Honestly, I thought you'd let it go. I kind of liked how you called him out, though. Shows you've got a spine." Her tone was light, but it didn't ease my irritation. Changing the subject, I mentioned my upcoming work trip. "This should be the last one for a while," I said. She sighed and nodded. "That's too bad," she replied. "I was hoping we'd get more time together. Especially since my big vacation is coming up soon." A lot of those people from the auction world are coming back into town for the season, and there's going to be a grand event. That's the secret one I told you about. Her excitement was clear, but all I could focus on was the timing. It felt like too much was happening while I'd be away. Once the trip started, the days felt routine at first. I stayed in touch with her, but our calls were brief and centered around mundane updates. Then, a message from my best friend, who also happens to be an attorney, disrupted the monotony. "Hey," he wrote. "Did you get a new car?" I frowned, confused. "No." "Why?" I replied. His next message made me sit up straight. "There's a bunch of luxury cars parked near your house. Among all the black ones, there's a bright red Jaguar that stands out. Just thought I'd check." That comment sent my thoughts racing. "Not mine," I texted back. "I'm out of town, so that's weird. I'll explain later, but can you swing by later and see if they're still there?" He agreed, promising to keep an eye on things. The red Jaguar was too specific a detail to ignore. I couldn't shake the image of that smug kid from the dinner party bragging about his flashy new car. As the day went on, I found myself unable to focus on work. The whole situation felt off. I texted my wife, casually asking if she'd noticed anything unusual at home, but her response was short and dismissive. "Everything's fine," she wrote. "Why do you ask?" That didn't do much to calm my nerves. Something was going on, and I hated being stuck hundreds of miles away, unable to figure it out. Later that evening, my friend followed up. "Cars are still there," he said. "Looks like some kind of meeting or party. Should I dig deeper?" I told him to hold off for now, but my gut was telling me to get home as soon as possible. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. The next morning, I made a decision. I called my boss, feigning illness. "I'm feeling awful," I said. "I've been sick all night, can barely keep anything down. I need to head back early." There was a pause on the line before he sighed. "All right," he said. "But I'll only be able to approve partial pay if you cut the trip short." I didn't care. "That's fine," I replied. "I just need to get home." As soon as the call ended, I packed my things and made arrangements to leave. I wasn't about to sit around any longer while strange cars parked outside my house and my wife brushed off every question. The sooner I got home, the sooner I'd get to the bottom of it. When I got home, it was late in the evening, and my friend had already texted me earlier to confirm that the cars were still parked outside my house. I decided to take a cautious approach. Leaving my car a few blocks away, I walked toward my home under the cover of darkness, staying out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I rounded the corner and approached the property. Something about this whole situation felt off, and I needed to see for myself what was going on. I circled around the house quietly, sticking to the shadows. As I approached one of the living room windows, I saw a scene that made my blood run cold. My wife stood at the center of the room, while several well-dressed individuals sat in chairs around her. Among them was the son of the older man from the dinner party. My wife was holding a marker and writing on a whiteboard, something to do with bids, it seemed. I pulled out my phone and began recording, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach as the scene unfolded. What happened next left me stunned. My wife, as if on cue, began removing her clothing piece by piece. The men in the room clapped and cheered as if this was all part of some sick show. I couldn't believe my eyes. She cheated on me with this guy. I kept the camera steady, capturing every detail while rage built up inside me. I had seen enough. Whatever excuses she might have had, this was beyond anything I could tolerate. After the guests had their fill, they began leaving one by one. Soon, only the son of the older man and my wife were left in the room. I realized this was my moment. Quietly, I made my way to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Without hesitation, I grabbed the pistol I kept for emergencies from its hiding spot and stormed into the living room. The shock on their faces when they saw me was almost satisfying. I pointed the gun directly at the younger man. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," I said, my voice calm but laced with fury. He immediately raised his hands, stammering. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll give you whatever you want. Just don't do anything crazy." My wife, meanwhile, screamed for me to put the gun down, pleading with tears in her eyes. I ignored her and kept my focus on him. "Empty your pockets," I ordered. He fumbled with his jacket and pulled out a wad of cash that could have paid off my mortgage twice over. I grabbed it and gestured for him to keep talking. "Wait," he said. "I've got something else." He carefully slipped his pants on and headed toward the door. For a moment, I thought he was going to make a run for it, but instead, he walked to his car. A minute later, he returned holding a luxury watch. "Take this," he said. "It's worth more than you can imagine. Just let me go." I took the watch and motioned for him to leave. "Get out," I said. "If I ever see your face again, you won't get off this easy." He bolted out the door without another word. My wife tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Not a word," I said. "I'll deal with you later." With the money and watch in hand, I left the house and drove to my parents' place. I needed time to think, away from her and all the chaos she'd brought into my life. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but one thing was certain: I had a plan, and it would ensure that neither she nor anyone else involved in this mess would ever cross me again. When I returned home, I didn't waste any time. My wife was waiting, trying to act as though nothing had happened, but I wasn't interested in playing along. From now on, I told her firmly, this marriage happens on my terms. If you want to stay, you'll follow my rules. No questions, no negotiations. She looked startled but nodded, likely thinking I was just blowing off steam. She didn't realize I had already made up my mind. Later that evening, I called my best friend. "I need the number of a good divorce lawyer," I told him. He hesitated for a moment before giving it to me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Completely," I replied. "But I don't want her to know yet. This needs to stay under wraps until I've got everything in place." He agreed, and I wasted no time contacting the lawyer and starting the process. For the next few weeks, I acted as though everything was fine. Meanwhile, I was working behind the scenes to secure my freedom. I gathered the necessary paperwork, set up meetings with the attorney, and prepared the evidence I had recorded. The video from that night was my trump card, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. Once everything was ready, I released the footage anonymously to multiple media outlets. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The video went viral within hours, sparking outrage and widespread curiosity. Journalists dug into the people involved, and it wasn't long before the spotlight turned on the young man's father. With paparazzi now following his every move, skeletons from his past began surfacing: tax evasion, shady business deals, and more. His reputation crumbled overnight. As for my wife, the scandal hit her harder than I expected. Her employer didn't hesitate to cut ties, citing the negative attention as a liability. She was devastated, alternating between anger and desperation as she tried to figure out her next move. At first, she didn't suspect I had anything to do with it. But as days passed, I noticed her looking at me differently, as though she was starting to put the pieces together. One evening, she broke down completely, crying about how everything was falling apart. "I've lost my job," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do." Her tears didn't move me. Instead, I responded with a cold smile. "What a shame," I said. "Don't worry, though. I've got a surprise for you tomorrow. You're going to love it." She looked at me with a mixture of hope and confusion. "What kind of surprise?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "You'll see," I replied, keeping my tone light. Inside, though, I was already planning my next move. The divorce papers were ready, and tomorrow, I'd hand them to her along with a reality check she wouldn't forget. As I watched her retreat to the bedroom, I felt a strange sense of closure beginning to settle in. This wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about reclaiming control of my life. Tomorrow would mark the start of something new, and I was more than ready for it. The call from the lawyer came early in the morning. "The divorce papers are finalized," he said. "You can hand them to her whenever you're ready." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. That evening, I walked into the house with a wrap box in hand, determined to see this through. When I presented the box to her, she looked at me with a confused smile. "What's this?" she asked, shaking it lightly. "Open it and see," I said, my expression giving nothing away. As soon as she lifted the lid and saw the documents inside, her face twisted in shock. "What is this?" she screamed. "You can't be serious. You're divorcing me? After everything we've been through?" Her anger quickly turned to hysteria. She threw the box across the room and began shouting, calling me every name under the sun. "You're a monster," she cried. "How could you do this to me?" I stayed calm, watching her meltdown with a sense of detachment. "Go sell yourself at those auctions you love so much," I said coldly. "I'm done." Without another word, I went to the bedroom, gathered her clothes, and tossed them out the window onto the front lawn. She stood frozen, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Get out," I said firmly. "We're done here." She stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter in the chaos. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up her phone and began scrolling through it, my suspicions growing with each passing moment. What I found confirmed every dark thought I'd had. Beyond the auctions, there were dozens of messages and photos documenting her affairs with wealthy businessmen. Some were tied to the auctions, while others were private rendezvous. It was worse than I imagined, a web of lies and betrayal stretching far beyond our home. Realizing the potential impact, I decided to leak the information anonymously. Just like with the video, I sent everything to multiple media outlets. The fallout was immediate. High-profile names were exposed, marriages were put under scrutiny, and the facade of respectability these men had built crumbled overnight. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about making sure they all felt the consequences of their actions. As the media storm raged on, I began to feel a strange sense of closure. My wife's life was in shambles. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now her marriage. Meanwhile, I started planning my next steps. The watch I had taken from the son of that older man was worth a fortune, and the cash from his jacket wasn't insignificant either. Together, it was enough to cover my legal fees and fund a fresh start. Sitting in the quiet of my now empty house, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the chaos, it was all behind me now, or at least that's what I told myself. With the divorce papers filed and the media frenzy taking care of the rest, I was finally free to move on. But as I glanced at the watch on the table and thought about the storm I'd unleashed, one thing was clear: this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The divorce was finalized without any complications. Since my wife hadn't worked a single day during our marriage and the house and assets were in my name, she walked away with nothing. Legally and financially, it was as clean a break as I could have hoped for. The scandal surrounding her involvement in the auctions and affairs had left her reputation in ruins, closing any potential doors she might have turned to for support. Her world, once so glamorous, was now completely inaccessible to her. With the settlement behind me, I decided to start fresh. The watch I'd taken from that smug kid turned out to be worth a small fortune, and the cash I'd recovered was more than enough to cover the legal fees. I put the house up for sale and used the proceeds to fund my move to a quieter city closer to my parents. It was a deliberate decision, a way to distance myself from the chaos and start rebuilding my life in a place that felt more grounded. The process of selling the house and relocating wasn't without its challenges, but it was a relief to leave behind the memories of everything that had happened there. I bought a modest but comfortable home in my new city, one that felt like it belonged to a different chapter of my life. The first night there, sitting in the quiet, I finally felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. A few weeks after the move, my ex-wife called me. Her tone was desperate, pleading for another chance. "We can fix this," she said. "I've changed. I'll do anything to make it right." I listened silently, letting her words hang in the air before ending the call without responding. There was nothing left to say. Her apologies couldn't erase what she had done, and I had no interest in reopening old wounds. Instead, I focused on securing my future. The money I had left after the move wasn't going to last forever, so I decided to be smart about it. I reached out to an investment analyst, someone who could help me turn my remaining funds into a reliable source of passive income. It was a practical step, but one that felt empowering. For the first time in years, I was making decisions purely for myself, without the weight of someone else's betrayal hanging over me. The investments began to pay off slowly but steadily, giving me a financial cushion that allowed me to breathe easier. It wasn't about becoming wealthy, it was about stability and the freedom to live on my own terms. I started spending more time with my parents, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of stress and disappointment. As for the question that might be lingering in the minds of anyone following my story, why didn't I see it sooner? The answer is simple: I trusted her. That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? A partnership built on trust. Looking back, there were signs, but I ignored them because I wanted to believe in what we had. It wasn't until the facade shattered completely that I could see things for what they were. Now, I live a quiet, stable life, far from the drama and deceit that once consumed me. Thanks to the investments and the careful planning I put into my new start, I don't have to worry about money or unexpected surprises. I've built a life that's entirely mine, free from the shadows of the past, and that's exactly how I intend to keep it.